Hi, afternoon, everyone. It's nice to be here. My name is Rachel. I work with Village Capital. We're an American nonprofit. We have an affiliated micro VC fund, VilCap Investments, and we've been operating in sub-Saharan Africa since 2012. We've supported about 150 African-led ventures who have gone on to raise $330 million, and we've made about 15 catalytic investments ourselves as the nonprofit. And I am your moderator here today. And so I will hand it over to the panel to quickly introduce themselves, and then we'll get started.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. My name is Emmanuel. I lead the team at Madica. We are an Africa-focused, sector-agnostic pre-seed investment fund. We, basically invest across the continent at the very early stage. We, in addition to investing up to 200K tickets, we support the founders for 18 months post-investment. We're kind of trying to experiment with a different kind of model for supporting founders across the continent, which I can speak a bit more about. And that's important because of the sectors, the geographies, and the kinds of founders that we back. We think that beyond capital, there's additional support that founders need to be able to scale. And yeah, we've been on the journey for 2+ years now, closed 8 investments. I'm excited. About 50% of them have female CEOs across 8 different countries, 6 different sectors. And yeah, that's what we do.
Hi, my name is Oliver Scheidt, originally from Namibia. Like Dan, if you haven't been, definitely go and visit. And then earlier this year, started my own consultancy, the Strategic Economy, following having previously worked for the UK trade envoy to Uganda, Rwanda, the DRC, focus on supporting businesses that want to invest in Africa.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Nonnie. I'm a principal at Enza Capital. Enza is a multi-stage Pan-African VC firm. We invest from pre-seed right through to Series B, tickets of 250K up to 5 million. We are truly Pan-African, from north right down to south, including South Africa, West Africa, Anglophone West Africa, as well as Francophone West Africa, and of course, East Africa. And we are thematic investors, but look to fintech, AI, climate smart, human capital as our sort of core sectors.
Cool, thank you all. So the first question is, we just heard from David that the majority of funding is going into these big 4, but obviously Africa is a very big place with many countries and lots of potential. How would you define those hidden gems in the African ecosystem, and what would really make a startup or region stand out to you? Yeah.
I think for us, we have a very specific definition of what underrepresentation means. It's clear from the data, most of the funding goes to not just 4 countries, 4 cities in those countries, so Lagos, Nairobi, Cape Town, Cairo. And then majority of the funding also goes to fintech, majority of the funding goes to male-founded companies, and then, if we're being honest, majority of the funding also goes to founders who are already connected to Silicon Valley, are experts, or already have those networks already. So for us, we think about underrepresentation across those 4 dimensions. How do we find founders, in markets that are not well represented, in sectors that are not well represented, to female founders or female-led teams, and to founders who, are truly local and who sometimes don't have a lot of the networks or may not even be as polished as what a lot of VCs expect when founders reach out to them. And that doesn't mean that we lower the bar in terms of who we invest in. We're still looking for venture-backable businesses, venture-scale businesses, but we believe in going one step further to, understand the context. Sometimes on the surface, they may not look like what a lot of VCs, are looking for, but when you dig deep or provide just a bit more support to the founders, then you find out that these guys are building, really good businesses. And the way I like to think about it, it's a lot easier to teach someone how to pitch their business than it is to teach them how to build a fundamentally good business. So for us, it's, going into those kinds of markets, finding businesses like that, and then providing additional support to, in a sense, remove some of the perceived risks that a lot of VCs would not be comfortable with. So that's kind of how we think about like gems in general.
Yeah, I think David mentioned it when he talked about Rwanda, and what they did with Zipline was quite interesting because when Zipline wanted to come into the country, they realized there wasn't a regulation around it, and Rwanda then said, actually, you go and suggest what the regulation should be. And I think it's countries like that that take a very forward approach to say, let's not over-regulate, let's actually work with the sectors to kind of move forward.
So in terms of what we look for, first of all, as Enza, is we're looking for founders who are using technology to solve large and meaningful problems across the continent. And two of the areas that we're super excited about and have now done a number of deals in are North Africa. So of course, starting in Egypt, we have a colleague who's based there and has been there for about 9 months. And one of the interesting things about Egypt is incredible technology sort of talent, really outstanding talent, but also it's a very localized ecosystem. So we felt that we really needed to have a presence there. My colleague is there. We have Arabic speaking capabilities, which also really, really helps, because I think a lot of founders in Egypt are very wary of tourist capital. They want really value-adding investors. And then the other advantage for a firm like Enza is they also want knowledge from the rest of the continent, so that we can also provide value add outside of Egypt. The other area we're super excited about is Francophone West Africa. First of all, the currency, is pegged to the euro, so it doesn't have a lot of the volatility that is being experienced in other markets. And the other exciting part about Francophone is, of course, that it operates very much like a block. And so we've done a number of deals in Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, and we like the fact that it is, again, fairly localized and often forgotten. There is a language barrier. You have a different sort of jurisdiction and legal framework. Having said that, though, there are a lot of opportunities there that are unexplored at the moment. And so we're hoping more and more investors also come into Francophone West Africa.
Yeah, very interesting. We're hearing kind of Rwanda as an opportunity because of the regulatory environment, Francophone West Africa operating as a bloc outside of kind of the big four. What other countries are on your radar that you think are kind of overlooked or have a lot of potential?
Maybe picking up, starting with the North African context, I would 100% say Tunisia and maybe Morocco as well. For various reasons, a lot of which Nonnie talked about, but in addition to that, the average Tunisian speaks 3 languages, right? So English, French, Arabic. And because of the proximity to Europe and the GCC region, a lot of them are building in a way that they can sell across Europe and across like Saudi Arabia, and that region. And so that's one. I think 2 also is the fact that there has been a lot of like investment in talent over the years. So historically, they had this precedent back in the days was like, education is free up until like your university. So there's actually a lot of like really talented, folks in that market. And I mean, I don't know anywhere else on the continent where there is a concentration of deep tech startups, right? If I'm looking for deep tech startups, I would 100% go to Tunisia, go to, Morocco maybe as well. But that for me is like, I mean, when you go to Nigeria, I'm Nigerian, so I can afford to say this. Like everyone is building fintech. Like there's nothing like really exciting, but like no one is building like things that are like really science-based. But you go into some of these markets in North Africa, and like people are building like really fascinating stuff. And so that's a market that I'm particularly like very excited about. I would agree also with like Francophone, Africa, and not just West Africa in general, because there is a barrier that not everyone kind of understands the dynamics. And I think that there are a lot of untapped opportunities there.
So maybe Nonnie and Oliver, we could hear a little bit from you about what do you think are some of the misconceptions that you experience with foreign investors who are seeking to enter some of these secondary markets, or that aren't kind of your Egypt, your Kenya, your Nigeria, and South Africa?
I think one of the, I think it's across Africa, is people still view it from a Band-Aid lens, and they still think Africa is what it was 30 years ago, and they forget that actually there's 30 years, a lot has happened. I mean, you look at a hidden gem, Namibia would definitely be one of those. The stability that they've had over the last 35 years, recently elected their first female president, strong, stable government, and it just shows that actually Africa is very different to what people conceive it is.
I think there are a lot of misconceptions, but I think one of my favorite ones is that it's one market. You get a sort of TAM that says Africa, 1+ billion people. First of all, obviously, every single country is so diverse and so different from a cultural standpoint, from a currency standpoint, and also from just a needs standpoint. So I think not treating the continent as one market, is probably where we should start, and really trying to understand the nuances and the key problems that are trying to be solved in the different countries, because it is highly fragmented. And just because you can sort of maybe scale in Nairobi, as you said, it is very much city to city, doesn't mean that your business is going to translate as well in Kampala, which is literally next door, but again is so different.
I mean, a lot of the investment theses would be built on the fact that scale is multiple countries in Africa. So the startups that you're seeing do that well. How do you think they're approaching it well, and how are their investors helping them?
That's a really good question. So we've had a number of businesses that, of course, start in one country and then scale into another. Off the top of my head, I'm going to point to Turaco, which is a micro-insurer. Began in Kenya and actually Uganda. The founder had lived in Uganda for a number of years, so knew that market very well. Knew Kenya obviously very well as he then settled there. In both of those countries managed to acquire an underwriting license. He then bought a sort of competitor, a smaller competitor in Ghana that enabled him to kind of scale into Ghana. A competitor that actually he used to work for. So again, scaling via acquisition is a great strategy. And then use an organic approach into Nigeria. Lo and behold, Nigeria is the one that's growing slower than the other three. But of course, in his last round, he raised looking at where his investors could provide the most value. And so there's a lot of support coming from the Nigerian investors, just helping him kind of navigate in that country. So I think organically, definitely, but try to get support from your investors, whether they can open up networks on the ground, whether they can also, whether it's business development or further funding, maybe it's debt capital that you acquire in local currency, for example, but also M&A as a strategy. And lastly, maybe run small pilots where you don't have to create a large kind of overhead in terms of expenses, just running really small kind of pilots that allow you to test very quickly, and try and see what kind of feedback you're getting from customers and kind of make sure that sort of feedback loop is rapidly firing. So you're getting a lot of data from these small pilots.
Awesome. Super interesting, Nonnie. So we've heard a lot about how obviously talent is a driver in underrepresented regions. You said with the tech talent in Egypt, the deep tech talent in Tunisia. And hearing from Nonnie now, just how important it is what the investor is bringing to the table beyond the capital. What role do you think diaspora investors and operators, what do they need to better understand going into these underrepresented regions? Maybe Emmanuel.
Yeah, no, I think it's always helpful to partner with folks on the ground. So even for us, we don't assume we know all of these different markets all by ourselves, right? So what we do is, if we want to do an investment in Ghana or Tanzania or whatever market that's interesting to us, it's always important to find who knows that market better than we do. I mean, let me take a step back. It's always helpful if you can spend time in those markets, because there are some things you would never know without actually spending time there. But spending time is one thing, but also finding and partnering with people or collaborating with people who understand the space. They will tell you who are the folks who are BSing you, who are the folks who are building the real deal. They help you with due diligence sometimes. and just kind of getting a feel for what is real versus what is fluff, right? I can't overemphasize that point, but I also want to emphasize the point about like, you know, going into the space and going with the intent of learning. I think a lot of folks from diaspora, you know, come with this mindset of not even just the savior mentality, but almost like, I've seen what works in Europe, America, you know, I want to go replicate that there. But there's a lot of like local intelligence that, you know, folks on the ground know that, you know, whatever Harvard MBA you have, you know, can't compete against, if we're being honest, right? So I think coming in with that mindset of, you know what, I want to also learn and I want to understand how things really work. That mindset coupled with, you know, collaborating with folks who are on the ground, I think is the way to go.
Can I add one as well? I'm not pitching, but invest into funds or join angel syndicates, because actually there's a lot of information that you'll learn from, you know, the various opportunities that go through angel syndicates. And of course, if you are able to, you know, investing through funds, you get a diversified kind of portfolio, and you also learn a lot from your GP and teams on the ground.
Yeah, that's a great segue to my next question. We're hearing a lot at the moment about, you know, the necessity of local capital providers, of partnering with organizations that have experience in market if you're entering the market. So how do you ensure that you're not just chasing the hype and that you're identifying kind of those more long-term opportunities? And maybe we'll start with you, Oliver.
I think sometimes people, they try and think Africa is different, and in some ways Africa is different, but also a lot of the things that happen in Europe are also happening in Africa. If we look at mobile payments, for example, I mean, Kenya started that in 2007, and that's gone really well, and actually they have a higher rate now than in the UK. And it's actually investing in markets that already work in Europe, that just don't exist already in Africa. The infrastructure is not there, but it needs to be built because it's not there already.
And maybe hearing from Emmanuel and Nonnie, obviously running VC funds in Africa, you know, there has been pushback, you know, is VC a viable option for Africa? What do you say to the naysayers? Is VC viable in Africa?
No, it's funny because like I woke up to a text from my elder brother this morning and it's like, yeah, like is VC still a thing, or like as the bubble burst? Like, and my honest answer to him was like, as with everything, like it depends, right? I think VC is a great tool, but it's not for everyone. So I don't necessarily think, you know, every business needs VC, but like is VC as an asset class, you know, is it viable? Even in Africa, absolutely, I think. But I don't think every business is best suited for like VC in general. But with that said, I think it's also important, you know, I think there's a certain kind of, you know, and I almost think it's so let me take a step back and explain what I'm trying to say. Like the focus on like unicorns, you know, I think we also need to manage our expectations. That's not to say that we won't have and we can't get unicorns in Africa. We will. But to be honest, even in Silicon Valley, like unicorns are the exceptions, right? And, you know, I was reading at school recently about how a lot of the celebrated VCs, even in Silicon Valley, you know, who were founders themselves and exited their business, if you go check their exits, they're like 49 million exits, 100 million exits. You know, most of these guys didn't even build unicorns. So why sort of the obsession about like unicorns? And I think it's also unfair on Africa, which when you think about our journey from like a VC standpoint, to expect us to have like a lot of unicorns from day one. So I'm saying that to say that like VC is a viable asset class even in Africa, but I think that there is still an unhealthy obsession, so to speak, about like, so where are the unicorns? Right, if you see what I mean.
I definitely agree with that. And to add to it, I think we have to remember that it's still a very, very young ecosystem. You know, if you compare it to Silicon Valley, which is probably 70, 80, you know, plus years old, VC in Africa is maybe 10 to 15 at best. And, you know, just needs a little bit more time to grow. And again, just to create that kind of circular movement. We've got fantastic talent on the continent. We now have lots of VC firms on the continent. We're starting to see more angels as well on the continent. And so as you know, we just need more and more of this to continue, more deals to take place, and crucially more exits to take place so the flow of capital can come back into the industry from the exits and kind of really prove the point that it is working. And also we have ancillary service providers across the continent. So legal firms are getting, or they are, fantastic, but they're starting to really kind of penetrate into the startup scene. Advisory firms, more and more on the continent now that are looking at the startup scene. And hopefully more corporates as well, maybe corporate VCs or corporates as acquirers. And so again, the ecosystem just needs time to continue maturing.
Nice, yeah. To echo the point that David made earlier around how the ecosystem is kind of increasing in nuance and people are kind of structuring deals a little bit differently. They're kind of reviewing their return expectations to reflect the realities, and I find all of that very exciting. Oliver, let's go over to you for a second. So in terms of a policy reform perspective, what would you say that you've seen kind of the most exciting developments to unlock startup growth in the region?
Digitalization. I think it's a major thing, cut down on bureaucracy, but also when it comes to the cost of doing the paperwork and the time it takes. And especially in a startup, every penny matters. And if you're spending so much money getting all the right forms and everything, instead of having an online website where you fill it all in one place, makes such a difference.
Yeah, I remember we did this digital financial service research project like in 2015 with Gates, and it was like, oh, the underlying structure of ID systems is like a necessary for all DFS businesses, and now that's kind of a given, so it does really catapult things. Please.
Yeah, I do see a few countries, also pushing for startup acts, in some of their markets. I think some have gotten it right, some are still like figuring out stuff, but the important thing here is sort of that concerted effort by the government to say, how can we become an enabler rather than, or how can we leverage, our resources to open up the environment, which some of the elements that I've seen in some of the startup acts, it's like, are there incentives for angel investors, for instance, to Nonnie's point, are there incentives for the founders themselves, like tax incentives and things like that. A lot of those things that incentivize, but also like remove regulatory hurdles for startups, I found those to be very helpful because in a lot of ways, the role of government is to just, clear the path and sort of stay out of the way. And the governments who approach it from that standpoint, I've seen like that to be very helpful. One other thing that I'm seeing that's also interesting is, governments, deliberately investing in like fund of funds of sorts where it's like, okay, how do we create funds that invest in either, funds that invest in startups already in the country or that are looking to expand into the country. I think Morocco is trying to do something like that, so that's one good example as well. So yeah, those are two things that I've seen that can be very helpful.
Yeah, it makes me, many years ago, Emmanuel, you were part of Andela, Nigeria, no? And isn't that, there's this story that Ian, the co-founder of Flutterwave and Andela, tells about the Yaba Collective, I think they were called, and it was the early days of the Lagos ecosystem, and they kind of bypassed the government, but they worked together, and then when they had reached a critical mass of influence, effectively, of fintech startups, then they started pressurizing the government for political reform. So it can also come from the startup ecosystem if it's done in the right way. And obviously this co-founder of CC Hub, Basun, is now the MP of Entrepreneurship and Technology in Nigeria, which is also just a very exciting development. All right, Emmanuel and Nonnie, I would love to hear more about your founders. So when you're looking for talent in these kind of overlooked places, or not the big four, when you're in Francophone West Africa, when you're in Tunisia, what are you looking for in the founder? Like, what makes them kind of the jewel that stands out that you take a second look?
Go first. I feel like I've been going first.
Okay, sure. So I think we're looking for, firstly, the skill set. Does this founder have the skill set to really execute on this? Does the team, the team that they've put together have the skills and experience and potentially networks to execute on their ambition? In terms of kind of qualities in a founder, we're looking for definitely grit and super clear ambition, of course obsession about it, and just constantly thinking through how they're going to push their product through and win the market. You really want to look for someone who really wants to win. And I think there's a high correlation between success and that kind of that internal driver of needing to win and wanting to win. But yeah, apart from sort of skills and those softer qualities, I think we are potentially also looking for somebody who, I hate the word coachable, but somebody who is open to listening to feedback, who won't take it as criticism, who will be able to kind of stand their ground if they don't necessarily agree with it, but also who will be able to implement the feedback if it is something that they haven't thought about already, and that willingness to learn and sort of the humility, to take that feedback without it being kind of perceived as criticism.
So I would echo like Nonnie's points. I think the one additional point that I would add would be, generally speaking, we're also looking for people who, are good human beings, for lack of a better word, right? I think one quick filter, and some might say this is biased, but like, I ask myself, can I work for this person, right? Do I see myself like actually working, because it's kind of a marriage, so to speak. Like you're investing in someone like early on, and like the relationship needs to work. I'm like, how do they treat their employees? Because a lot of our due diligence process is very like reference based, and that's also some of the things that we're trying to pick up. Like, what do others say about this person? What do others say about like working with them? Are they a jerk? Those type of stuff. I think are really important. But at the end of the day, it's, in addition to that, are they obsessed about like the problem that they're trying to solve, and are they obsessed about their customers? Is something that we really look out for. And then do we feel like they have enough subject matter expertise in that space, or have they surrounded themselves with like really, strong talents that can make up for gaps that we all do have? But just to clarify, we don't just invest in Tunisia, we invest across.
I know we're at time, and I'm looking for Dan here. Maybe, do we have enough time to take some questions?
Like 1 or 2 questions.
Does anyone have any questions you want to ask? Yeah.
I thought it was interesting hearing about is venture right for ready for Africa. I think the question I have is like, is the macro really ready? You look at fintech banks here, neobanks have gained customers and their revenue and profitability compared to the same in Africa, and fundamentally, the economics and the demographics, etc., are very different. So my question is it ready to have a VC model that is also driven by returns, in 7 to 10 years, when ultimately it's not just the ecosystem that's developing, the whole economy and continent's developing?
Anyone want to take that?
Since I've been speaking about Tunisia a lot, I can use a Tunisian example and like a deep tech example. So part of the point that I was making, so I'm sure we all know InstaDeep, right? I think they're a good example of how to think about like, venture in Africa, so to speak. So Tunisia itself is a really small market. Population is like 12 to 14 million or something like that, right? But, there's a world where you build in a way that you're thinking about like scale from day one. And yes, you talk about macro, but like when you think about, the opportunities, sometimes even beyond like Africa. So again, Tunisia is a unique market because they are positioned close to Europe, close to like the GCC region, but just using that playbook to say, hey, yes, there are macro conditions that can make, building businesses like difficult in certain contexts, but what is the unique advantage? And each market, has its own unique advantages, right? So, Nigeria has a really large market, but we all know how much like currency devaluation and things has happened over the last year, for instance. So it's not necessarily the size of the market per se. It's like, what is unique about each market? And it kind of goes back to the point that I was making earlier. If I'm sitting in London and I'm just looking at Africa, like the macro may not look good, but when you spend time in each market, you then start to understand, okay, this particular market has something unique about them that despite the macro, as you will, there are potentials to build like venture scale businesses even in that market. And one has to do that work, market by market, sector by sector, so to speak. And to be honest, that's what makes it like difficult to invest in Africa sometimes. And that kind of ties back to the point that I was making earlier about, collaborating with folks who know those specific markets. Because again, if you just look at it from the outside, it's like, why should I be looking at Africa? But when you go like market by market and look at each of their competitive advantages, you realize that there are actually a lot of like really interesting opportunities despite what the news says.
I'm just also going to add, if we look at those kind of top line fundamentals, obviously there's population, the continent with the youngest population, digitally native population, also smartphone penetration has trended in the right direction in terms of following, other kind of leading countries or markets. We've closed the gap with India in terms of smartphone penetration. Our internet penetration across the continent is also really, really strong. Having said that, though, GDP per capita across the continent is much, much smaller than the rest of the world. And in some areas, it's actually even contracting. And so you do have to look for those smaller pockets of sort of high growth opportunities, and look for businesses that are super capital efficient as well in those particular markets that are growing really fast. To add to Tunisia, I'd say Egypt. Egypt as a standalone country, you can have a sort of billion-dollar company. But then in Kenya, you really can't, for example. So I think it's not only looking for those fast pockets of growth and remembering that GDP per capita is small, but also readjusting perhaps your idea of the size of the potential outcome. So instead of looking for those billion-dollar sales, we may be looking at $200 million sales. So I think it's just kind of reframing it. But yes, I do believe that VC is viable in Africa. Put my career on it, so I'm hoping it is.
Yeah, another question? Did everyone get a question? No. When you're looking to attract LPs for a fund in Africa, how much overlap is there with kind of Silicon Valley, Europe, and how do you balance the local investor expectations in Naira and CETA, for example, with what those more traditional LPs would be looking for?
Yeah, I'll answer one part of the question because I think it speaks to the challenge with like raising capital for especially emerging fund managers in Africa, because in reality the competition is LPs could potentially just invest in like stocks and get great returns, and it speaks to Nonnie's point earlier about the fact that we're literally still, somewhere in like fund one or early like fund two, if you will, like in Africa, right? And the model, it takes time to prove that model. So I think a lot of the LPs who would be investing in Africa need to understand that and be comfortable knowing that, I mean, it's the early days, but then a lot of those fundamentals that Nonnie spoke about earlier in terms of what the opportunity is in Africa, broadly speaking, I think the trend and like the data is that, you know, there's a lot of data around like the potential for Africa specifically if you look at a lot of those fundamentals. But in terms of how well we've proven that, I think it's just a function of time, and LPs need to get comfortable with that. And I think it's, you know, work. To be honest, it makes it very difficult for fund managers to raise funds because when you're comparing against, you know, raw data from other regions, but that's kind of what they need to believe and the work that, you know, fund managers need to be able to convince LPs of. But it is difficult, and especially when you compare with like what returns you can get from other proven asset classes in other more advanced regions.
I think to add to that, of course, in terms of LPs, the majority of most funds LPs are DFIs, and of course they have a mandate to catalyze FDI investment into the continent. But beyond those, there are a lot of foundations and family offices and philanthropists, and I think that whilst they are looking for some type of return, one of the other sort of priorities for them is impact, and I do believe that it is possible to generate kind of these social returns alongside commercial returns. So I think for a lot of the LPs who are looking at the continent, they are looking to see whether their money is going to have some form of, whether it's environmental, social, etc., impact, you know, on the continent.
Great. Yes. Do we have time for one more question? I'm so sorry. I think I'm being told we got to wrap up. So the last thing to do is just say thank you so much to our amazing panelists, Nonnie, Oliver, and Emmanuel. And thank you to you all. And thank you, Dan.